Hello and welcome to The Take with Sophy Ridge, live at 9 here in the heart of Westminster. Now, I want to do a slightly different programme today because it feels to me that for a long time, Westminster has been dominated by personality politics. The rollercoaster of who's up and who's down, the Boris show, can Liz Truss outlast a lettuce? But today, well, it feels pretty serious. Inflation was expected to come down, and it didn't. Interest rates nailed on to rise tomorrow. What is going on with the economy, and just how painful is it going to get? We'll try and find out as we bring you takes from all sides over the next 60 minutes.
We need to squeeze every last drop of high inflation out of the economy.
Well, it's bad news for everyone with a mortgage, but it's also bad news for the Chancellor there because it means much higher costs for the government's debt, and that is now bigger than the economy. And it is, of course, also bad news for this man who was on the defensive earlier.
What do we hear from the Honourable Gentleman? He wants to borrow an extra £28 billion a year. That would make the situation worse.
And the Labour leader, of course, took every opportunity to try and make the Prime Minister feel uncomfortable.
Whilst his government is consumed in law-breaking chaos and division, working people are paying the price.
With talk of interest rates heading towards 6%, we're going to try and have a grown-up conversation with our guests on the show this evening. In a while, we're going to hear from the Transport Secretary Mark Harper. The Labour MP and member of the Treasury Select Committee, Rushanara Ali, will be on the programme. Plus, we're going to be talking to the economist, Gerard Lyons, and much more besides on The Take. Hello and good evening. Well, it certainly is all eyes on the economy this evening. The Bank of England almost guaranteed to raise rates by at least a quarter point, maybe even a half point. And those rates are likely to stay higher for longer because inflation is remaining stubbornly high. There's been lots more going on too, so let's crack straight on and start with the best bits of the week so far.
3.5 years ago, Boris Johnson led the Conservative Party to election victory. But tonight, MPs voted to remove his pass for the House of Commons.
Are you going to miss Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak? Or is it good riddance?
This matters because the integrity of our institutions matter.
They go from the vindictive to the ridiculous, with not allowing him a parliamentary pass.
I was assured that I should continue the work that the House had mandated with the appointment that the House had put me into, and so I did just that.
Yeah.
The ayes to the right, 354. The noes to the left, 7.
It's level, but level at a really troubling number, 8.7%. The expectations were this number will be starting to fall.
We won't be pushed off course because if we're going to help families, if we're going to relieve the pressure on people with mortgages, on businesses, we need to squeeze every last drop of high inflation out of the economy.
Minds here in London are really focused on not just winning the fighting on the ground, but winning the peace afterwards.
We are sending a message that our support on the battlefield and beyond cannot be outlasted.
When we build Ukraine, we'll build freedom. Country, region, continent, world.
The Prime Minister has a keen interest in the mortgage market in California, but I'm talking about mortgage holders here. And whilst his government is consumed in law-breaking chaos and division, working people are paying the price.
What do we hear from the Honourable Gentleman? He wants to borrow an extra £28 billion a year. That would make the situation worse. He wants to ban new supplies of energy from the North Sea. That would make the situation worse.
Well, it feels like there's been an awful lot of Boris Johnson in the news recently, as that shows, but I really do want to concentrate on the economy this evening. Let's start with the government, shall we? Because a few moments ago, I spoke to the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper. We were expecting inflation to fall, but it's now stayed at 8.7%. Are you still confident that you're going to meet your target to halve inflation by the end of the year?
I think the forecasts that there are out there from the various forecasters still say that inflation is going to fall to that level by the end of the year. Clearly, it's taking a bit longer, but what that actually says to me is that we've got to remain focused on halving inflation, and actually what the government's got to do, the Bank of England has the primary responsibility for reducing inflation with its monetary policy. What the government's got to do for the decisions we take is make sure we help the Bank of England achieve that objective. We won't help anybody if we take steps that cause inflation to rise. So that's why we've had to...
What kind of steps would cause inflation to rise?
Well, it's why, for example, we've had to make very difficult decisions, which you and I have discussed before on your programmes, about public sector pay, for example. It's why the government has had to make fair and reasonable offers to people, but have had to make ones lower than inflation, because if we'd made inflation-busting pay rises, that would have... forecasters have suggested that would make things worse. We've got to make sure we keep the public finances under control. So that means making tough decisions about how you prioritise spending. So I think if the government does what it has control of and works with the Bank of England, that's how you give the Bank of England the ability to drive down inflation and meet the government's objectives of halving it by the end of the year.
Are you really keeping government spending down, borrowing down? I thought debt was now 100% of GDP.
Well, we're controlling public spending.
Doesn't really sound like it, does it?
We've made a lot of difficult decisions. You know, I set out some
borrowing up
choices.
Again last month.
I set out some difficult choices in my area of transport budgets earlier this year. That's why we're making... I've been on your programme a lot talking about the tough choices we've had to make on public sector pay. So I think the government is making those decisions, but it's necessary to get inflation under control. That's actually the most important thing we can do. If we don't do those things, we slow down the fall in inflation, and that doesn't help anybody.
And interest rates, I guess, it's inevitable they're going to go up, right?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on them. That's, you know, we've only got to wait until tomorrow. Those are decisions for the Bank of England. No one welcomes a rise in interest rates, and I don't underestimate how tough it is for people. It's one of the reasons why over the last year the government's provided £3,300 on average of help for every family. A lot of that, obviously, is the help with energy bills. Obviously, as energy bills come down, that help won't be as necessary. So we don't underestimate the difficulty for people. We're not pretending this is easy, but getting inflation down is the thing that will help people the most.
I guess, you know, you talk about energy bills there. Some mortgage owners would think that's kind of the point, right? You know, you had this huge intervention to help people with their energy bills when they were going up through no fault of anybody's, and people having to swallow these huge bills. People on mortgage rates, on variable rates or coming off their fixed terms deals, I think we can have a quick look to sort of show how high they're due to go and how painful that could potentially be up to... This is just the last few days, you can see going right back up to the average interest about 6%, 5.72%. Some people will be saying, this is disproportionately impacting a smaller number of people. Why aren't you stepping in specifically to help them?
Well, look, I think the Chancellor was asked this question specifically yesterday when he was in the House of Commons, and he made the position very clear. If you pump more debt into the economy, you actually slow down the fall in inflation and you actually make things worse. So the best thing you can do is work with the Bank of England, help them drive down inflation. The forecasts that are out there from independent forecasters, so not the government's forecast, still say that inflation will be significantly reduced by the end of the year. That is the best way we can help people, including homeowners who are facing higher mortgage rates. And the government's not pretending it's going to be easy for anyone, but unless you get that inflation under control, actually you're not helping anyone at all.
Now, I just want to talk about this in like really simple sort of language, right? I'm not an economist, so I'm just trying to kind of get to the bottom of what's going on in the simplest of ways to help people like me who are trying to get their head around all this, right? So we need inflation to come down, and the way we're trying to do this is to make borrowing more expensive and, as you say, to make sure wages aren't going up too quickly. So in other words, is the aim to make people feel poorer so they stop spending so much money?
Well, it's to slow down the economy a little,
by stopping people spending,
bit,
right?
To reduce spending, and then that helps bear down on inflation, and then on keeping.
So that is kind of that. It's correct then. Isn't
keeping
it, really,
discipline
right?
on public sector pay, which is the thing the government control, is partly for the direct effect of controlling public sector pay, but also to make sure that you then don't drive up pay elsewhere in the economy, because keeping pay under control is important, and that's difficult as well. You know, people. We've had this conversation about
it's
matching.
Going to be really
if you
painful.
do inflation-busting pay rises, that doesn't help anyone either.
So I'm just going back to what I'm trying to work out, right? So in a way, it's going to be painful but that's kind of the point.
Well,
It has to be
look, I
to
said
get the inflation down.
I said, look, no one thinks this is easy for people, but if you don't get inflation under control, the worst thing is not getting inflation under control, as the Chancellor made clear. So I think we have to stick with the course we're on. You know, we have seen it come down, but it's not coming down as fast as we would like. So we've got to stick with it. That's the best tax cut you can deliver people, is to get inflation under control.
Okay,
but I don't think we were pretending it's going to be straightforward.
Let's have a look at the international comparison, because we had months of people saying, look, the target is to get inflation down. That's what this government is all about. It's you made it one of your prime pledges. You've said judge us on this, right? And if you compare the inflation rates in the UK, the US and the Eurozone, I just want to have a look here. UK inflation 8.7%, the US 4%, the Eurozone 6.1%. I mean, it looks a bit like a UK problem.
Well, no, if you listen to the ONS when they were setting out the inflation figures, I listened to them carefully, one of the points they made, you've got to be careful with the comparisons internationally because of the way we've chosen to support people with energy prices, and that actually does make a difference in the international comparisons.
So this is wrong, then?
Well, it does make a difference in the international comparisons. The ONS said that themselves. But look, inflation's been high globally. Interest rates are going up around the world.
Except, I'm not trying to have a go in this interview. I'm trying to get to the bottom of stuff, right? I'm trying to have a grown-up conversation about this.
Interest rates have been...
If there is a UK-specific problem, is it not better to say, this is why, this is what we're going to do about it?
Interest rates
there's a problem in order to fix it, right?
Interest rates have been high anyway. We've been very clear that inflation has been sticky in terms of coming down. Part of the reason... You know, when we were having all the conversations we've had this year about public sector pay...
So why are they stickier in the UK? Why are they stickier in the UK?
Because one of the reasons we made the point about public sector pay was to make sure we kept pay under control, because one of the things we were concerned about was not doing that would cause a problem.
Why is it stickier in the UK? Why is that?
Well, if you listen to the ONS, there's lots of factors that drive inflation. Some of it's international, and we're suffering from some of those as well. Energy prices, food prices, and things like that.
Impacted by this in the UK.
Some of it's on the effect that pay has in the economy. And one of the other things is, you'll know, post-pandemic, we saw a lot of people leave the labour market, which means you've got a very tight labour market, which pushes up pay. One of the things the government is doing, things that we can control through the Department for Work and Pensions, is looking at helping people who fell out of the labour market to get back into the labour market, which helps then
it's high wages.
Pay under control.
You effectively think it is higher wages?
Well, that's part of the problem. If you look at the things that are driving up prices, that's why we want to get...
So should people take a pay cut?
That's why no, that's not what the government's saying. We're saying we want to get more people into the labour market. That's what we're doing through job centres, looking at skills, getting more people into the labour market, and that's how you enable the economy to continue growing but keeping pay under control.
Do you have confidence in the Governor of the Bank of England?
Yes, the Governor of the Bank of England has a difficult job to do. The job of the government and the Chancellor is to work with the Governor and the Monetary Policy Committee to support them to get inflation under control. They're doing an important job. It's a tough job. They're independent for a reason. They have to make these tough decisions. But the government's working very closely and has confidence in the bank, yes.
Why do you have confidence in the Governor of the Bank of England?
Because I think he's making the tough decisions with the Monetary Policy Committee that are necessary. It's never popular to put up interest rates.
But I think the
bank
criticism
has a
is
job.
that they were too slow, right? That's a criticism, isn't it?
Some people make that criticism, yes, and there was a decision to make at the beginning about whether inflation was transitory or not. I mean, you may remember Rishi Sunak made it clear when he was Chancellor that he thought inflation was a problem. Actually, he saw that early on.
And you think maybe the government...
One of the reasons why I backed him to be Prime Minister, because I think he knows his stuff when it comes to economics. That's why he wants to support the bank in driving down inflation, because he knows that it's only when we get inflation under control that we'll be able to then lower interest rates and get the economy motoring and grow it.
OK. We'll have to see what happens, but certainly, you know, difficult, as you acknowledge yourself, a difficult few months, if not longer, a few years potentially ahead for the UK economy. I wanted to talk to you about Ukraine, if I may, as well. You were announcing more support for Ukraine.
Yes, so the Prime Minister, as you know, there's the Ukraine Recovery Conference today and tomorrow, which the government is hosting with the government of Ukraine, which is taking place in London. And the Prime Minister this morning set out further support for Ukraine in terms of guarantees for loans. Also, very importantly, an insurance framework, a risk framework to enable the private sector to have confidence to invest. And President Zelensky spoke virtually at the conference this morning. I spoke at one of the sessions following the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine for some of their reconstruction efforts. So the government remains focused not just on helping with supplying weapons and other support, but also helping with the reconstruction of Ukraine and helping them keep their economy going, which I think is incredibly important.
OK, thank you very much.
Thank you.
My interview there with the Transport Secretary Mark Harper, and a bit later we're going to have a closer look at the state of the economy and tomorrow's expected interest rate rise, what it can mean for people in the coming months ahead. But first though, let's get a bit of immediate reaction to that interview. We can talk to Sam. One of the things that jumped out to me was when he was talking about the Governor of the Bank of England. Very careful not to directly criticise him, but he did kind of make the point that maybe he misjudged inflation a little bit at the beginning. What did you think?
Oh, definitely one, maybe two raised eyebrows at what Mark Harper just said to you, because the Transport Secretary actually went there. He went there with the criticism that you're hearing in private from loads of Conservative MPs over in the Houses of Parliament. Now, back in 2021, Andrew Bailey, who was at that point pretty new to the job of Governor of the Bank of England, said that he thought that inflation was transitory, pretty temporary. And basically, he was making an argument not to overreact to it. See how that's gone now. Now, what Mark Harper did is something that we saw quite a lot of when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, which is criticism by government ministers of the Bank of England. And he said, actually, Andrew Bailey got it wrong, Rishi Sunak got it right. And that's one of the reasons why I backed Rishi Sunak to be Prime Minister. But that is criticism. And that's criticism by a Cabinet Minister of the Bank of England's governor. That didn't end well last time.
It didn't, but you can also see, can't you, Sam, the frustration that perhaps some people are feeling that the bank isn't tackling it in the way that it needs to do. I want to just get to a kind of wider point that I was trying to get to in that interview, which is I want to kind of strip away all the sort of serious long words and which I think sometimes, to be frank with you, politicians use so they don't have to completely face up and be truthful about what is happening, which is that they want people to feel economic pain in order to bring inflation down. Not because they're, bad people, but because they think that is the best way of getting to the economic place they need to, right?
That's right, and this goes to the heart of why I think they're so worried in Number 10 and in the Treasury, because we saw this morning inflation figures of 8.7%, same as last month, but critically core inflation going up. It's going down in America. It's going down in the Eurozone. You can see the overall inflation figures here. But the way that you deal with inflation traditionally is to put up interest rates, to put up everybody's borrowing costs, because then the theory goes that people can't afford to spend as much, and then that economy cools down, prices come down, and you see the interest rates going up here, but those interest rates going up are meant to stop people spending, to curb their spending habits. But the big nightmare for this government is that that's not happening. The rates are going up. They're pulling the lever in the Bank of England, but spending isn't slowing because people are churning through savings that they built up during the pandemic. This primarily affects people with variable rate mortgages. That's not a huge number of people, or people who come off fixed rate mortgages. And whilst we're talking low millions of people, there are still, 30, 40 million households. So there are lots of people who don't suddenly feel a big squeeze in their income from these interest rate rises. Sure, there's pressure all over the place, but it's not having the effect that it should. And ministers are sitting around going, well, if you pull the lever and nothing happens, we're not sure what to do. But the most likely outcome is the Bank of England keeps putting up rates yet further, and maybe there is something of a bigger kind of slump, a bigger problem, a bigger moment later on where people suddenly really find that they can't afford things.
It's genuinely quite worrying. Sam, thank you very much indeed for your analysis, as always. Sam's take. We'll have more from Sam later on in the programme, including this pretty cool new polling tool that we've got to show you. Anyway, we're live here in Westminster. Up next, we'll be taking a closer look at today's Prime Minister's questions.
Harper Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
It's turning everybody into, you know, a crazy, violent drug addict.
How are you feeling? I am angry. Are you a hypocrite, sir? Will your candidates win?
I hope so.
I gotta be realistic. My sister's dead.
More than 4 weeks on, there's no murder weapon and no suspect. Mum, how are you feeling today?
Jeffrey said, you answer to Ghislaine, you just don't cross her.
You're so excited.
Severe nightmares of these people coming in and just taking me in the middle of the night.
I've watched as whole towns were torn apart by natural disaster.
I'm alive and I'm thankful for that.
We take you to the heart of the stories which shape our world.
A lot of cases that I know are reported from Ukrainian missiles themselves.
Ambassador, with respect, I think that's preposterous.
Welcome back live to Westminster. You're watching The Take. Now, Rishi Sunak's day started by introducing the Ukrainian president at a conference in London, but the Prime Minister faced a more hostile audience at lunchtime in the Commons. PMQs was dominated by exchanges with the Labour leader on the UK's worryingly stubborn inflation, as Keir Starmer attacked the PM over what he called the Tory mortgage penalty facing families. Here is PMQs Unwrapped with our political correspondent, Jay Pike.
This morning's shock inflation figures meant Keir Starmer only had one option, asking about the economy, and he went big on the blame game.
He knows very well the cause of the mortgage catastrophe. 13 years of economic failure and a Tory kamikaze budget which crashed the economy and put mortgages through the roof.
The Labour leader also seemed to have a new three-word attack line.
Will the Prime Minister tell us how much the Tory mortgage penalty is going to cost the average homeowner?
I'm told you'll hear a lot more of that in the next 12 months. Sir Keir also snuck in a mention of Selby in Yorkshire, location of a key by-election next month. And in response, Rishi Sunak's strategy was to argue economic challenges are evident internationally.
Perhaps the Honourable Gentleman could explain why interest rates are at similar levels in the United States, in Canada, in Australia and New Zealand. But in contrast, what do we hear from the Honourable Gentleman? He wants to borrow an extra £28 billion a year. That would make the situation worse. He wants to ban new supplies of energy from the North Sea. That would make the situation worse.
Now, Keir Starmer's advisers say it was a deliberate choice to focus on the issue concerning voters, the cost of living crisis and rising mortgage rates, and not deal with the soap opera of Boris Johnson and the Privileges Committee. But the Labour leader still managed to slip in the odd dig.
Mr. Speaker, I realise the Prime Minister spent all week saying he doesn't want to influence anyone or anything. It was certainly keeping to that with his answer. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Prime Minister has a keen interest in the mortgage market in California, but I'm talking about mortgage holders here. I'm sure from the vantage point of his helicopter, everything might look fine, but that's not the lived experience of those on the ground.
All that seemed to leave the Prime Minister looking a little irritable.
No amount of personal attacks and petty point scoring can disguise the fact that the honourable gentleman does not have a plan for this country, Mr. Speaker.
Now, personal attacks and petty point scoring may not be the point of PMQs, but they're always a regular feature. And as Keir Starmer didn't major on Boris Johnson, the SNP's Westminster leader, as well as Labour backbenchers, filled that void.
Given the dire economic reality of today, is it not now clear that he's taken his honesty lessons from Boris Johnson?
Does the Prime Minister believe that the reward for being a lawbreaker should be to be made a lawmaker?
So just to recap, during this Parliament we've had one Tory Prime Minister who turned out to be a proven liar, a second Tory Prime Minister who was outlasted by a lettuce. After this week's pathetic no-show by the Prime Minister, what one word would he use to describe himself? Might it be weak?
What's weak is the party opposite being unable to stand up, is being able to stand up to the people who fund them and stand behind hard-working families in this country.
Rishi Sunak's time as Chancellor during the pandemic and his supposed mastery of economic issues was, and remains, a key selling point of his leadership. And he doesn't seem to enjoy all of that now being a target for opposition parties. Whatever the truth of the causes of both the cost of living crisis and the mortgage rates increase, Labour is unlikely to let up with its attacks. And as homeowners increasingly feel the bite, that may prove painful for the PM.
Jay Pike there, it feels like it may indeed prove painful for the PM, likely to dominate all the way up to the next general election campaign. We are live in Westminster for you. You're watching The Take. Up next, we are going to be taking an even closer look at the issue that we are discussing in detail today, the state of the economy and how stubborn inflation could influence the next general election. Hello, welcome back live to Westminster. You're watching The Take. Now, all through the programme, we've been talking about that incredibly stubborn inflation, worse than in other places like the US and the Eurozone, which means the Bank of England is almost certain to raise interest rates tomorrow, with potentially many more rises to come. Our business and economics correspondent Gurpreet Narwan can explain.
Inflation really is the problem that won't quite go away. And you can see how sticky it is here. The blue line, we're over the hump, but it's not falling anywhere near as fast as policymakers would like. It stayed flat at 8.7% last month. That's considerably higher than the bank's 2% target. And look at this. Before the lockdown, it's also a lot higher than the type of inflation we're used to in the UK. So we've got some way to go to get it back down. And when we're thinking about what's driving this persistent inflation, well, you can see that food and drink is easing off right at the bottom there, that red line. But prices here are still rising at an annual rate of 18%. So don't be fooled by that red bar. Meanwhile, at the top in the blue, it's leisure pursuits like eating out, recreation and culture that are now driving inflation. So even though prices are rising, people are still finding money to spend. And it's possibly why the Bank of England is worried about robust pay rises that workers in Britain have been securing. And this type of spending is becoming increasingly a problem. We will often hear that inflation is a global problem caused in part by factors out of our control, like the energy crisis. But if we strip away volatile items like food and energy out of the headline rate, we can see that underlying pressures, so that's the red line or core inflation in the UK, is rising. That's something our counterparts in Europe and the US are not grappling with. And all of this, it's uncomfortable for a government that's trying to figure out how it may tempt voters next year ahead of a general election. Government debt, as you can see here, as a proportion of GDP, is at its highest since the 1960s. And soaring interest rates make servicing that debt all the more painful. So it's a tough state of affairs for a country grappling with the cost of living crisis and a government that's been talking tough on inflation, but not yet delivering the desired results.
Gurpreet there talking us through some of those all-important charts. Now, back to the politics, because Keir Starmer was making a lot of Labour's new phrase, the Tory mortgage penalty. I feel like we're going to hear this quite a lot at PMQs today. So let's get the view from Labour now. We're joined in the studio with Rushanara Ali, who also speaks on the Treasury Select Committee as well. Thanks very much for being on the programme.
Hi.
How much of a shock was it today when inflation just didn't fall?
It was a huge shock, but in some ways it's not surprising, because what we've seen is that the UK has got some additional dimensions to the crisis we face. First of all, other countries didn't have the Liz Truss mini-budget fiasco, which has had a direct impact on people's mortgages. It has led to a follow-on budget where the new Chancellor has had to introduce a consolidation package. So that's quite different from other countries. And also we entered into the pandemic with the uncertainties around Brexit, with a trade agreement that did leave outstanding issues around supply chain disruptions. You know, inflation, food-related, food price inflation is higher for us in terms of what we import from the European Union. So there are some factors that makes it harder for the UK. But I think that overall, I would say that when you compare the UK to other countries on mortgages, the UK is worse off than France, than Germany. And that, I'm afraid, is down to economic mismanagement underpinned by political instability that we've had in this country for the last few years, but particularly the last year, which has consequences on the economy.
It's obviously the easiest thing for Labour politically to blame the Conservatives for this. I'm not saying that that's not, you know, there's no factor in this at all, but I just wonder if there's also something you could say about the way that the Bank of England has handled it, right? Because there's people who say that they were too slow to react to what happened, and so are having to overcompensate. And also that they did pump an awful lot of money into the economy through quantitative easing and stuff as well, which has an inflationary effect.
I mean, I'll come on to that. If you can't say If you think Labour shouldn't call out,
I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that, and I also allowed you to. I'm absolutely not saying that, and I also allowed you to make your points. But I'm just saying that the difficult question, I guess, is: do you think this is partly because of the Bank of England as well?
Well, I think that there is certainly an issue about the point at which quantitative easing should have been phased out. And some of us, I certainly raised those issues about whether inflation was going to be transitory, which is what the Governor of the Bank of England thought at the time would happen. His argument is that they didn't see Ukraine coming, they didn't see the energy crisis coming. But we are much more vulnerable as an economy because of the Brexit uncertainties and other factors that are quite unique to the UK. So yes, one could argue that with the benefit of hindsight, it would have been much better for the Bank of England to take action earlier and phase in interest rates gradually. But we did have a major pandemic. I think the other issue, though, is that last year, and it's not a political point, last year, again, I raised these issues at the Treasury Committee, before the Liz Truss budget came, it was very clear that if she won, she was going to go in the opposite direction to the Governor of the Bank of England in terms of trying to bring inflation, keep inflation under control, and yet Liz Truss was proposing a big budget spend that was not, it wasn't clear how it was going to be funded. And we were arguing that this divergence was very dangerous and there wasn't enough policy coordination. What we're seeing again is the current government isn't actually being coordinated enough with the Bank of England in terms of providing support to mortgage holders. They could be much more assertive in working with the bank as well as not compromising independence, but certainly with the regulators.
I'm just asking because my understanding, I'm no expert, is if you trying to help people with their mortgages, then that is going to be, that's kind of negates the point, right?
Well, you can do certain things. What you can do is make sure, first of all, the government has done very little and the regulators haven't done enough to make sure that savers have the interest rates, that the increase in interest is passed on to savers. That's about 23 billion a year. If we're serious about taking money out of the economy and bringing inflation down, then the government needs, the Bank of England and the Financial Conduct Authority needs to be more assertive in ensuring that banks pass on those saving rates to savers.
How would you see that happen?
I think there's a role for the regulator to do that. And also in terms of what the government sets out and encourages the banks to do. I know that the Chancellor's meeting some of the major banks later this week. He needs to make it very clear that we expect to see, along with the Governor of the Bank of England and the head of the FCA, we expect more, interest rates to be passed on to savers, because that would help in terms of reducing the money supply in the economy. The second thing is that the FCA could do more in terms of making sure that they provide guidance to banks about spreading out mortgages over a longer period of time. Now, we need to be careful that that doesn't then mean the actual cost of borrowing in the long term is borne, yet again, by the mortgage holders. But if we want to take if we want to prevent repossessions, then we do need to look at ways in which the regulator can direct banks to be sensitive to repossessions and make sure that they put in place plans to support them. If you look at the amount of profits the banks have made recently, it's pretty phenomenal. So they could do more to prevent the distress, which would be damaging for them as well if people face repossession on a large scale.
Really interesting to talk. Thanks very much for being on the programme today, Rushanara Ali there. Well, if that was a view from Labour, we can hear now from someone who's often seen as an economist of the right, Dr Gerard Lyons, an economist who used to advise Boris Johnson. He joins us now live from Kent. How worried should we be about stubborn inflation?
Yes, we should be very concerned. The reality is that the two key factors that led to the initial surge in the inflation were external global factors and very poor monetary policy by the Bank of England. They completely misread the situation. And both of those factors, in some respects, are now being reversed. The global factors have gone. The Bank of England is catching up with where they should have been. The challenge now, coming directly to your question, is the second round effects. Firms are passing on the higher costs either to maintain profit margins or to increase profit margins. You've also focused on wages, although it should be stressed, last year wages were not the factor accounting for this inflation. So the second round effects are now evident. That makes us more concerned as economists, and that's why we should all be worried. The reality, though, is it's the Bank of England who really should be taking the blame here. They completely misread the situation a couple of years ago. The markets now have no confidence in the Bank of England. The governor and the MPC are seen as lacking competence and lacking credibility. And the real challenge now is that the Bank of England, even though they should be pausing in some respects, like the Americans last week, the US Federal Reserve, their central bank, has credibility. They were able to say, we're going to take a pause with a bias to raise rates again if necessary. That would be the position we should be in the UK if the Bank of England had credibility, but they don't. So tomorrow they're going to be forced to raise rates, probably quite sharply, probably by 0.5%, and they still will have a bias to have to raise rates again to try and get on top of the situation. So the worry should be not only about inflation, coming back to your question, but the fact that the Bank of England is now going to have to push rates up to such a level is going to weaken the economy, and if they push rates up too much, force a recession.
I mean, that is pretty grim, to be honest, listening to you. Really interesting to hear where you quite clearly put the majority of the blame. I guess my next question is, what do you think should happen next? Are we doing the right thing by increasing rates and having the squeeze and the pain that entails, or is there another path available?
Yeah, well, to answer that question, I think it's vital that people understand where we were a couple of years ago. At that time, I was on Sky saying, the question is, which P is it? Will inflation pass through? Will it persist? Or will it become permanent? The Bank of England said it was going to pass through quickly, be transitory. It was quite clear then, 2 years ago, they were wrong. Now we have inflation persisting. 2 years ago, when inflation hit 0.4% in February 2021, it was clear it was going to pick up. In fact, only 2 months later, it went above the 2% target. It was clear the economy was about to rebound as it was being unlocked. Therefore, in that situation, interest rates should have been increased. What happened? The Bank of England kept rates low. They injected a phenomenal amount of money into the economy through quantitative easing, and all 9 members of the MPC, Monetary Policy Committee, voted for it. And I'm on 2 boards in the city, and in early 2021, we received letters from the Bank of England saying, be prepared that your systems can tolerate negative interest rates. So not only did they not act, they went in the wrong direction. Since then, their credibility has been hit by the fact they've always been seen as too late. The way they communicate is literally terrible. There's a parallel universe between what is often said in the political world and what's actually said in the dealing rooms in the city. And now we have a situation where the city, global markets are saying, look, you need to show that you're on top of this situation. And unfortunately, the economy here is vulnerable because monetary policy tightening works with a long lag, 12 to 18 months. So we've already gone from interest rates of only 0.1 to 4.5%. A large part of that has yet to actually hit people and yet to hit companies. But now, because of the lack of credibility and because of the poor inflation figures for the last few months, inflation expectations are rising. The bank is going to have to push rates higher. What would I do? Well, if I was there, we wouldn't be in this situation because it was quite clear 2 years ago what needed to be done. But now we are where we are. You have to basically restore credibility and confidence. What the bank has to do in monetary terms is effectively what Jeremy Hunt had to do in fiscal terms last autumn. He had to try and restore some credibility by taking tough action. The bank now has to do that. But when an economy already has interest rates at the highest level for some time, and parts of the economy are vulnerable to higher rates because they're over-leveraged, that means the more you push rates up, the more you're going to add to problems in terms of the real economy. So if one looks at the government's 5 measures, 3 of those are economic measures. Inflation will fall, albeit stubborn at the moment, but it will fall. But the price of it falling might impact 2 of those other 3 economic measures the Prime Minister has highlighted, namely growth and debt. Because if the economy is weak and if interest rates are higher, our debt picture, government debt, becomes more vulnerable. Has to be said, even though the situation is difficult in the UK, it is a Western world problem. We've been impacted a bit more by energy prices here in the UK, but it's a problem impacting Western Europe, the States, as well as the UK, but partly because of the reasons I've just articulated.
I just want to jump in, if I may, because I do want to get to one other point. You were mentioning debt there, and I think this is another big part of the conversation, right? You were saying that, look, the government has restored some fiscal credibility, but I guess my question is, has it? Because, you know, today we saw debt reaching 100% of GDP. We're talking about, you know, politicians clamouring for tax cuts if they're on the Conservative side. On the Labour side, they're talking about big investment. Do government really, politicians of all colours, really get fiscal restraint that perhaps is needed in order to keep inflation low?
Yeah, the International Monetary Fund a few months ago came out with something called their fiscal monitor. 6 of the 7 G7 countries will likely be in a debt trap over the next 5 years, according to the International Monetary Fund. That's where your debt is around 100% of GDP. That is the size of your economy. And the rate of interest you're paying on it is higher than your rate of economic growth. It doesn't really matter who's in power at the moment or who wins the next election. They inherit that very difficult backdrop. The choices then need to be made after that. So the way out of a debt trap is to basically get on top of inflation. That allows inflation to come down. It allows interest rates to stabilise, and then have a pro-growth economic strategy. But that takes some time. But for the moment, it's about stabilising the markets by getting on top of inflation. But coming back to your question, the best way out of the debt problem is to keep your interest rates low and to get your rate of economic growth up. And to do that, you need to actually have more proactive policies to help business and actually reduce the cost of living for consumers. The good news in the UK is the jobs market is pretty good. So it's not all pessimistic. The job situation is the one real positive out there at the moment.
It's quite nice to have a bit of a positive news, I have to say. I feel a bit guilty today because I feel like we're just having so much bad news in the programme, but it does feel like it's one of those days. When I was interviewing Mark Harper earlier, he made big points about pay restraint. He clearly believes, and this is obviously a view in government as well, that pay rises are driving inflation. Are they right?
Look, last year, the surge in inflation had nothing to do with higher wages, but partly because we haven't, as a country, largely because of the central bank, the Bank of England, not got on top of inflation. We're in that second round phase. And in the second round phase, wages and corporate behaviour in terms of profit margins is key. So it's not just workers, it's also what companies do. And that's why the argument is, it's a bit of a difficult argument, though, for the general public to hear, is that that's why people say you have to tighten monetary policy to slow the economy down. But do bear in mind, as I was saying earlier, monetary policy works with a lag. It's a long lag. What I hope is that the Bank of England doesn't overdo it by tightening too much. But coming back to your question, higher wages weren't the reason last year, but you can't blame people for seeking higher wages now because inflation is high. But as inflation starts to fall over the next year, one would expect wage increases to slow as well, the pace of growth to decelerate.
Really interesting to talk. Thanks very much for giving your perspective.
Pleasure to take it.
We certainly are hearing, I guess, some people starting to point the finger a bit towards the Bank of England. We've had lots of takes this evening. I want to take you back over to the screen area where we can chat to Sam, because we have something to show you tonight. What have we got, Sam?
We've got a new toy. Let's bring it up. It's something that we're going to talk about a lot on this show in the evenings on Sky News. Now, YouGov, Opinion, Mori, those are the names of lots of pollsters. You're going to be hearing about all of them in the run-up to a general election. Which one's the most reliable? Well, nobody will know until the day after polling day when we got the results. And every pollster uses a different way of measuring public opinion to find out whether Labour or the Conservatives are going to be in number 10, how the Liberal Democrats are doing, and all the other parties. So we have a new tool for you at Sky News. It's been launched today at 5 o'clock. Very pleased to do it on television for the first time. It is a poll of polls, a polling tracker. And what this does is it takes every single poll and puts it in one place. It gives you an average. So the danger when you overlook, because I don't think there's any secret we're Westminster obsessives. We tend to look at every poll and get excited, maybe even overexcited from time to time.
Never. Come on, Sam.
So what we've done, what you need to do is take a little bit of a sober look, a sober step back and look at how every poll fits with all the others. See if you can spot a trend, because it's trends in polling that really matter. And so we've taken all the polls and put them in one place and given you an average. And what this shows, doesn't quite show you on the screen, but this actually shows that the Labour Party leads the Conservatives now, when you look at every single poll, by an average of 18 percentage points. That's a pretty healthy lead for the Conservative Party. The Liberal Democrats are on 10, the Greens are on 6. Now, the thing that you've got to realise about this is that polls have a massive variety. So Labour could be as high as 48%, as low as 41% in the current range. That's why there's uncertainty. That's why we need to do this exercise, looking at every poll in the round.
And the great thing for people like me who do interviews with politicians, right, is because if you pull out a poll and you stick it in the screen behind you and you say, this is really bad news for your party, or you must be really happy and cock a hoop about this, they invariably say, well, you can't get overexcited about one poll. It's only a poll. Well, this isn't just a poll, right? So actually this, I guess, is our best evidence to
It's our
measure
best
it.
way of making sure that we don't get overexcited by one maybe kind of
outlier. Yeah.
Exactly, and because it's taking all of the data. Now, individual polls are still interested. The individual polls are the only way to get deep into the data, to look at different demographics, to look at how different bits of the population are behaving, how that's moving over time, but only by doing this. And you can see the trend. This is where Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. Immediately before you see that great big spike for the Labour Party, you can see over the course of the last 6 months or so, some of the edge being taken off the Labour advantage. But what you don't see back since November is any sign really of a Tory recovery. And if you look over here, the lowest poll for the Conservatives down at 26, but the highest at 29. That range is quite small. That suggests that there isn't a great deal of movement. There's not a great deal of uncertainty in that poll. Much more on the Labour side, but there's a big range.
Got to cut you off, Sam. Did you get the sense that Sam could talk about this all night for about 3 hours? Because I certainly do. Sam, fascinating. I'm actually really excited to see how this is a tool that we can use between now and the election as well. Thank you. We have got a bit of breaking news to bring you now, courtesy of our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, and that is about the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, and NATO. Well, we can talk straight to Deborah, who is dialing in to bring us the very latest. Deborah.
Yes, well, it's actually a scoop in The Economist. They've spoken to Ben Wallace and he's told them that he's basically out of the running to be the next Secretary General of NATO. It's a pretty secretive process, but we all know that Ben Wallace has been trying, with the backing of the Prime Minister, to get that top job at NATO, to take over from Jens Stoltenberg, the long-serving NATO Secretary General. A number of European countries had been backing Ben Wallace. He's really made a mark with the forward-leaning nature that the UK has had with support for Ukraine. But getting the backing of Joe Biden in the United States is a key part for any NATO Secretary General perspective. And it seems as though the United States weren't going to put their weight behind Ben Wallace's candidacy. And the Defence Secretary, in this interview with The Economist, says that the United States wants the current incumbent to stay in post until next year. And lots of sources have said that to me too, that the sense is that they want Jens Stoltenberg to extend yet again into 2024 and then next year for allies to decide who will be the next Secretary General. But frankly, just one last thing, it is quite strange that it's taken all this time and all the allies still haven't managed to decide who is going to lead them at this crucial time with war in Europe. But it's definitely not going to be Britain's Defence Secretary.
Really interesting. Deborah, a quick thought from you as well about, how much of a disappointment do you think this will be for the UK and for Ben Wallace?
Well, it's going to be a big disappointment, I think. People have made no secret. It's the process of being Secretary General. The candidates usually keep it quite tight in terms of whether they're running or not coming out until they know for sure they've got the job, because it's all done behind closed doors and allies agree it has to be consensus. But Ben Wallace hasn't denied the rumours that have been going around that he is in the running for this job. If it is true that Rishi Sunak did lobby the President of the United States on behalf of Ben Wallace, then if it is also true that the US has said no to that, it is a bit of a snub for the UK as well.
Really interesting. Deborah, thank you very much for talking us through that breaking story this evening. Well, that's it for The Take. We will be back next week and every week on Wednesday at 9 p.m. Lots to discuss with the economy tonight. Next up, though, it is Sky News at 10. Thanks for watching.